Okay, welcome back. Let's continue on with our videos. This video is topic 3.4, which is the philosophies underlying the American independence movement. So what we're doing here when we look at this topic is you want to be able to explain what philosophies were developing in the colonies. So in a large way, you're contextualizing the American independence movement here. So you're going to talk about, I'm going to teach you about what came before. So some of this is reminder, but we're going to look at how some of the developments in the colonial era influenced the philosophies of the American independence movement. And then we also want to know the major writings of this time period that are important. So things like Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence. So we're going to take a look at this. If you see on this screen here, I have the key concept that goes along with this. Goes along with this topic. Okay, so we're going to see the colonists' belief in the superiority of Republican self-government. So we'll define that. Was based on the idea of natural rights of the people. And this belief found its clearest American expression in Thomas Paine's Common Sense and in the Declaration of Independence. So let's look at these underlying philosophies that will be reflected in Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence. So first off, we want to kind of know something about the beliefs of these founders or these colonial elites is really who we're talking about that were pushing for independence. So they were students of the Enlightenment. And then in terms of religion, they had some unique religious beliefs. Okay, so one of these beliefs is the belief in deism. So if we look at this word deism, we know that deity means God. So deism is a belief in God, but this is a belief in God, a God that created the world, a God that created natural laws, but then is hands off and rarely intervenes in the world. So you can see this picture here next to deism of a clock with all of its gears and workings. Deism is kind of like the clockmaker, right? God made the world. The clockmaker made this clock. And then once it's all set in motion, the clockmaker rarely has to intervene. And that is how many of the colonial elites thought of God. This was a common Enlightenment belief, and these men and women, they were students of the Enlightenment. Okay, so, sorry, my hair is like sticking in my face. All right. The second thing I have on here is rationalism. Okay, this is also a common belief from the Enlightenment. Rationalism is the thought that humans can reason and use their own brains to understand the world, right? They can observe and use reason and thought and understand the natural world, and that humans were also capable of responding to life and social problems. So you take these two beliefs of deism and rationalism, and you have, you have kind of the religious beliefs of many of the founders. Now, not all of them are deists, but many were. So a good example of a revolutionary or a founding father that was a deist is Thomas Jefferson. He was very open in his belief. He believed in God, but he didn't believe that God was involved in the daily life of people, that people made the decisions. Okay, also when we're looking at religion, we have to think back to the colonial time period and some of the religious impulses of that time period. So we think back to John Winthrop, who was the first governor of Massachusetts. He he said that their social experiment, their society, was like a city upon a hill, that it was supposed to be an example to the world. He believed that they had like a God-directed duty to create this perfect society. And so this culturally is still in play as we get to the revolution. These colonists do believe that they have a purpose to create a society based on liberty. And then we also can see this reflected in the Great Awakening, the first Great Awakening, which happened like somewhere between 50 and 30 years, right? Because the First Great Awakening happened over time. For 50 and 30 years before the American Revolution, the First Great Awakening was a democratization of religion, right? Those people who were parishioners or followers of a religion, they demanded a different kind of religion, right? They demanded a change of their religious authorities, and it wasn't like picketing and screaming, but this was what happened, right? The parishioners demanded and flocked to this change, and so we see that the colonists learned that they can influence their religion. They're also going to influence their government. So these are some important things underlying the American Revolution. Okay, so we want to take a look at some more specific stuff. Okay, but remember, all of this is in the background. So specifically, the American Revolution is influenced by something called Lockean liberalism. And Lockean is for John Locke. He's here in his photo. So John Locke, and then liberalism is a political philosophy or a worldview founded on the ideas of liberty and equality, right? This is not like liberalism, like when we talk about in our current modern day political rhetoric, when we talk about conservatives and liberals. This is not what we're talking about. What I'm talking about is something called classical liberalism. And this is the idea that governments exist to protect the rights of the people, and that governments exist kind of to serve the people and at the will of the people. That's the idea of this liberty and equality. So in the terms of classical liberalism, this has Lockean liberalism because Locke wrote about natural rights. And this was really important to the colonists, right? So when Locke wrote about natural rights, he wrote about the pursuit that everybody as a human being had a right to pursue life. So life, liberty or freedom, and Locke said pursuit of property. This will kind of get changed in the colonies, but this was the idea with Locke. The pursuit of property, liberty, that's part of liberalism. So we can see this reflected in a few places in revolutionary rhetoric or writings. Sam Adams wrote about natural rights in Boston's Declaration of the Rights of the Colonists. This is in 1772. So he wrote that prior to the Boston Tea Party, for example. But the most famous and most important kind of statement of natural rights in our history is the Declaration of Independence, which was written by Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that human beings had a right to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which speaks to something different than property. When Locke said pursuit of property, what he really kind of meant when you dig into this was the pursuit of economic freedom, right? The pursuit of prosperity. That's what the pursuit of property was for Locke. But when Thomas Jefferson wrote Pursuit of Happiness, we have, as a nation, interpreted that to mean something more than just economic prosperity. It also means a kind of sense of self-actualization, that humans have the right to seek self-actualization or self-development. And so that like he took Locke's ideas and then expanded it in that Declaration of Independence. And that affects our view of ourselves and our ideals as a nation. Okay, the other thing that we see come from Locke that is reflected in writings by these revolutionaries is a belief in the social contract theory. And this is the theory that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. And so we see this over and over again as we look at the fights between the colonists and the British government. They are over and over again pleading for representation because they believe that government cannot act without the consent of the people. So this is like the real world reflection of all of those ideas from the previous slide of rationality and the Enlightenment and everything. So we have Lockean liberalism, And then the colonists also believed in a republican form of government. And what republican is it's a system that can either replace inherited rule like kings, or it can accompany inherited rule. And the colonists eventually choose that republicanism should replace inherited rule. But what they mean when they say republican form of government is it's referring to an elected head of state, right? So elected governments. And our modern usage of this word republican form of government is closely intertwined with democracy. So the people vote and choose. However, these revolutionaries didn't completely believe in a 100% open and direct democracy. What they wanted was more of a representative democracy, where the people elect a representative and then that representative will make decisions for them. And the idea here, what they're looking at in republicanism, is that each colony will elect their representatives to make decisions in the British Parliament. James Madison argues that a republic is different than a democracy because the former, the democracy, becomes weaker as it gets larger, and it suffers more violently from the effects of faction. And faction means like disagreement, so think political parties. Whereas a republic could get stronger as it gets larger, and it combats faction by its very structure. And so what he's saying is, as the country gets larger, it will still be okay because people will elect representatives, and that's going to balance out the swings of faction. And so I don't know if he's right or not, because we now have a very large nation, and it's really hard to put this completely to the test. But this is the view that the revolutionary founders, this is what they had, republicanism. Okay, there's also, when we're looking at these ideas of Lockean liberalism, republicanism, they're reflected in a piece of very famous writing from the revolution, and this is Common Sense. Common Sense was written in a couple of years before the revolution. It was written by Thomas Paine, and it was, in a sense, a form of propaganda, but it's not really propaganda. Thomas Paine had a definite purpose. He wanted to sway the people to independence, right? He's trying to convince the people to support independence. He's trying to bring moderates who would like to compromise with the British government over to the side of the radicals who want an independent colonies. He wrote in very clear and forceful language. It was easy to understand. It was published in newspapers across the colonies. It was published in a series. So like each week, there would be a new part of Common Sense published. So people would read it week to week to week. And this gives them time to consider, right? They read the first part and then they have a week to consider and think about everything. And then it comes out, the second part comes out and they have time to consider. But what Thomas Paine called for was breaking all ties with Britain and becoming an independent state. And he talks about how Britain is corrupt, that their laws were unreasonable, and he uses the phrase common sense. He says it's just common sense that a large continent like the colonies cannot be ruled by a small island clear across the ocean, right? He says, look at this, people. It's common sense. We have developed enough that we should be our own nation. And Thomas Paine's writing helped to solidify enough people behind the cause of independence that as we get to 1776, the Continental Congress was comfortable writing the Declaration of Independence. So Thomas Paine definitely had an impact with the general population. Okay, another person who is important, this guy is actually a Brit. So he's not a colonial, he's from Britain, an economist named Adam Smith. And he wrote a book in 1776, so he's not influencing the revolution, but his writings reflect the beliefs that many in the colonies had started to hold concerning economics. He wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. And this book is considered the initial or first book on capitalism. So Adam Smith is the father of capitalism. And what he argued was that government should not be directing the economy as they do in mercantilism. He said that the economy is regulated by something called an invisible hand. And what this invisible hand is the decisions of the people participating in the economy. So the decisions of buyers to buy certain goods, the decisions of manufacturers to make goods, at what price will they sell it at what price will people pay, right? So when you go to a store and you say, that's too expensive, I'm not going to pay that, you are being the invisible hand right now, because as people make those decisions, individual decisions don't change the economy, but as a group, those decisions change the economy. And that's what Adam Smith means as the invisible hand, that the aggregate of decisions in the economy by individual participants or actors will regulate the economy, and the economy will flourish. So he says government should stay out of this and allow manufacturers and allow businessmen and allow consumers, the buyers, to do what they're going to do. And so he rejects the idea of mercantilism. And this resonates with the colonists because they're rejecting mercantilism. They don't like the Navigation Acts. They don't like the regulations of the British government. And so the colonists, they agree with this when it comes out. And they agree that the economy is going to work most efficiently without outside restrictions. And this belief in capitalism has been enduring in the United States, right? There's still tension over what type of economy we should be, but capitalism has won out over the course of our history. So this has been an enduring kind of philosophy. So Adam Smith didn't cause the revolution at all, but when he wrote his book, it really resonated with the colonists. Okay, so if we're looking at our timeline, remember in the previous video, I stopped when we got to the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Okay, that was in April of 1775. Now, the Continental Congress has something that they have to decide now. So if you remember, they met as the first Continental Congress in the fall of 1774, and they sent their demands to the king. Okay, they said, we will meet again in May of 1775. So this second meeting is called the Second Continental Congress. And when we say Congress, we don't mean like a permanent sitting lawmaking body. To have Congress is to come together, right? So this is the second time representatives from the colonies come together to decide what to do. And so when they meet in May, shots have been fired. They have a decision to make, and there's very divided opinions in the Second Continental Congress. There are some who are advocating for independence, and those were most likely going to come from New England, right? New England was definitely, as a region, the area most committed to independence. And then the middle colonies, it makes sense from what we know of colonial regions, they were advocating more for reconciliation, some compromise, and some repair of the relationship between the colonies and Britain. And then southern colonies, it's kind of a mix. You have a lot of Virginians, for example, who favor independence. Some of them favor reconciliation. And so, we have very divided opinions in the Congress. So what they decide to do is to prepare for both options. So they prepare for a possible fight for independence, and they also try to have one more try at reconciliation. Let's try one more time. Maybe we don't actually have to fight, right? So they prepare in case they have to fight, and they hope for peace, maybe. So they take some military actions. The Second Continental Congress chooses George Washington to be the commander-in-chief. So he's going to be the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And so he's given authorization to start mustering troops, for example. And then they also identify a military leader named Benedict Arnold. He's going to take a force to raid in Quebec and he's trying to draw Canada away from the British Empire. So these 13 colonies are thinking, if we can get some of these colonies in Canada to join us, we will be stronger. And what's really interesting is we talk about the 13 colonies as being American because they become the United States, but the British also had colonies in Canada, and they had the same kind of cultural developments going on that our 13 colonies did. So these guys are hoping maybe we can get some of these Canadian colonies to join us. The reason they really weren't successful in doing that is because the British had a stronger military presence in Canada. And so the British were able to control and coerce those Canadian colonies into being loyal to the British. And then Canada didn't go through such a violent revolution as the American colonies because after this revolution, Britain relaxes with their colonies, and they realize that if we don't allow some more freedoms, we lose our nation. And so we have Canada, who is still a Commonwealth nation of Britain today. So, for example, they still consider the Queen of England their queen, but Canada is an independent nation politically, like has its own prime minister, its own parliament from Great Britain. And, that's because Britain had to relax. So that's kind of interesting. So they send Benedict Arnold to Canada. Those of you that are history buffs know that Benedict Arnold eventually changed sides. He became a spy for the British while he was a general. And then the Second Continental Congress, besides these military actions, they also made a peace effort. They wrote up what has been called the Olive Branch Petition. And this was a letter to the king that said basically, we are not to the point of no return, right? He says, let's make peace, let's sit down at the table, and let's compromise, right? So that's what the colonists said in this Olive Branch Petition. And that phrase, extending an olive branch, is like, that's used to extend peace. All right, so the colonists say, let's try one more time. When King George III received the Olive Branch Petition, he dismissed it, and instead he declared the colonies an open rebellion. So when George III declared the colonies an open rebellion, that's when the Continental Congress will say, this is enough. We've done enough. We have tried for peace. Now we are going to declare independence. Okay, so the Declaration of Independence was 1776. And it was written by Thomas Jefferson, mainly, right? His is the voice we hear when you read the Declaration of Independence. And it is a beautiful piece of writing. If you read the first paragraph and ending paragraph, he's very eloquent. In terms of ideas, he was assisted by Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. So we have John Adams later becomes a president. The other men serve in many government positions following independence. Benjamin Franklin was old at this time. He's the oldest of the founding fathers. But this declaration, we also often credit it to Thomas Jefferson, and his is the voice, but the ideas are coming from many people. Okay, there were 56 people that signed the Declaration of Independence, and when they did so, right, they knew that they were signing a document that would make them guilty of treason against the King of England. So you can see right here, I've written that there's 56 signers who sacrificed their lives. They didn't actually die, but if they had been caught, the punishment for treason is death, right? So they signed this document knowing, if I am caught, the punishment is death. If this does not go well, the punishment for me is death, right? And with that would be dishonor, and they would lose their fortunes. So they are literally risking their families and their homes when they sign this Declaration of Independence, because they are not 100% sure that they can win this fight with King George. King George III, he charges these men with treason. That's the risk they took in signing this. Okay, when we look at the Declaration of Independence, there are 4 sections, and this is a really important document to know. Okay, there are 4 sections here. The first paragraph is a justification and principles. So the Declaration of Independence, when you read it, the first paragraph basically says, we have tried to make amends. We have tried to bring our problems to the king, but he hasn't listened, right? And then there's also a declaration of principles in the first paragraph. And this is where Thomas Jefferson says, human beings have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then they also talk about social contract theory, for example. And so it lays out the purpose of government. Then there's a middle section. This is the longest section of the entire declaration. It's a list of grievances. So if you read it, there are line after line after line that says, he has. The he is King George III. So they say King George, they list their grievances. So things like, he has housed his soldiers. He has stationed his soldiers in our homes to spy on us. He has levied taxes on us that are unfair, right? They list their grievances. And then at the end of the grievances, the colonists respond and they say, all through this, we have asked for his help. We have addressed it through our governments and through our kings, and still he didn't listen. So therefore, Section 4, we declare ourselves to be independent, right? And what's interesting in this document is they say, citizens have a responsibility to overthrow their government if their government no longer works for them. And that has become enduring in our society as well. So when we're looking at the purpose, right, those are the 4 sections. When we look at the purpose of this, why did they do this, right? This was a very well thought out document. It has a couple of purposes. So the first one is to justify their actions, right? They have to say that what we are doing is fair. We are not just colonies in rebellion, but what we are doing is fair. Okay? The second thing they have to do is that they have to show that King George III is in the wrong. So they want to state their case against England. They want to shift the blame to King George III. The reason they're doing this is because one of the uses of the Declaration of Independence is as propaganda. They are trying to convince people to join the side of independence. Okay, they're trying to convince moderates within the colonies, so colonial citizens. They're trying to get as many of them as possible to agree that independence is the right step. They're also trying to convince other nations to join the cause because they realize that they are going to need the help of other more established nations to defeat the British. So they're targeting this at European nations where the Enlightenment as an intellectual movement is strong. So France, for example, that's probably the major one that these colonists are reaching out to. They're also trying to describe what they view as the purpose of government, and they want to establish under what ideals will this independent government of the United States operate on, right? What will be the ideals and values of this nation? So this document has quite a lot in it. And so this is where we see the culmination of all of those ideas of the Enlightenment, of rationalism, of the belief that there is a God-given purpose to the United States. It all coalesces in the Declaration of Independence. So I would definitely encourage you to go out there and read about it, right? Read about the Declaration of Independence. Read it if you want to. It is an excellent piece of writing, but also read some of the analysis of this document. Okay, so this is issued 1776. Now I want you to think about this as we look at these philosophical underpinnings of the Revolution. The American Revolution happened from 1776 to 1783. That's the actual war. But you can see here on my slide, some historians argue this American Revolution started in 1607. When the colonies were established and they began to practice under self-government. Some say this revolution is happening in 1607. And then this year here, 1789, this is the year the Constitution came into effect. So one thing that when you're asked to analyze the American Revolution, one thing that students are often asked is, was this truly a revolution or was this an evolution, right? So was this an actual overthrow of government or was this the culmination of an evolution that had been going on throughout the colonial time period? So somebody who would say it is an evolution, they would say that this has been happening the whole time, that there was a change or a revolution in thought from 1607 to 1763. So this is our time period too, right? So they would say that there had been a change in thought here. So over time, well, first off, the first settlers that came to the colonies disliked England, right? So there's already like not a really strong built-in loyalty to England, right? We have religious separatists that are moving away from England to live their religion in freedom. We have people who can't gain land, and so they leave England to come to the colonies for opportunity. So the early settlers already, they may not hate England, but they don't feel a particular loyalty to it. And when we also look at this time period, these colonists are isolated. It's a good 4 months of sea journey to get to the colonies from England, and that weakens England's authority. And so what we see develop in the colonies is a kind of rugged and independent people who have to survive in a wilderness. They survive without all of the kind of economic and manufacturing benefits of Europe close by. So they have to make do on their own, and they have to come up with their own governments. So they become independent. And so add into the mix the salutary neglect and everything else. And we see that this time period is a change in people's minds and thinking that really wasn't obvious to them as they're going through it. So the revolution in thought during the colonial time period led to a revolution in action. So 1763 to 1789, this is the end of the French and Indian War, again, to the Constitution. And so we've gone through some of this. Others we'll get to next week or in future videos. So we have like no taxation without representation. The Boston Massacre, colonial bloodshed by the British. This made people angry. The Battle of Lexington and Concord, it culminates in the Declaration of Independence. These are all actions taken after this evolution in thought had occurred, right? And so we know, because we're the United States, that there was a separation from Great Britain. And then historians argue, if they're saying this is an evolution over time, they argue that this culminated in the writing of the U.S. Constitution and a new nation. Okay, the reason I bring this up in this video is because as we get to the end of this time period, the thinking skill is change and continuity. What changes over time? What continues? And so that question, was the American Revolution a true revolution or was it an evolution? So basically they're saying, did this represent a real change or does this represent a continuity of what was already going on? I personally, if I were writing that essay, I like to say more was continuing than changed, right? Because when we look at the colonies, they did not change other than the British were no longer involved, right? I would argue that the real change in this time period was the change from salutary neglect to the reorganization of the British Empire starting in 1763. That was the real change. So this is, I think, a fascinating topic, and we'll come back to it. Okay, the next video has to do with the actual war for independence and the reasons that the colonists were able to win, because the colonies were definitely not a clear favorite at the beginning of this war. They were smaller, less organized, weaker, poorer than Great Britain, but somehow they managed to defeat the world's largest army or largest military force. So that's the next video, the reasons for American success. Okay, thanks for listening. I know this was a long one. Happy studying, APUSH.